Welcome to Sculpture Vulture. I'm Lucy Branch, a sculptural conservator and author, bringing you a series of interviews with some amazing sculptors who inspire me, and I hope will do the same for you. You can see the photographs accompanying the interview, the episode show notes, and get a free novel from sculpturevulture.co.uk. Hello, Sculpture Vultures, and thank you for joining me today. My household is just getting out of some COVID madness, with 2 out of 3 of my kids getting it. It's felt a bit like being on a sinking ship, but I'm glad to report that we still seem to be afloat, though, as my pessimistic son keeps reminding me, only as yet. In sculpture news, friend of the show, Amy Goodman, was kind enough to contact me and say how much she'd enjoyed Eve Shepherd's interview recently, and that there was a lot of what Eve had said that really resonated with her. I do encourage you to go back and listen to Eve's episode if you haven't. I think it was a really great one, and it's well worth your time. Amy has unveiled her memorial to the Gurkhas recently in Prince's Gardens in Aldershot, and there's some really lovely images if you like military sculpture. On Instagram, Amy's page is Amy Sculptor 1, and she chose a pose that must have been incredibly challenging to make, where one of the soldiers is carrying another over his shoulder, and you can really see that Amy, she's just challenging herself all the time at the moment with every work that she does, because when you contrast them, you see what her personality makes of each subject. And I loved the really feisty galloping Arborfield horses. And then there's also, this tough military figures that have been put in place, and then there's also this really sweet little Florence Nightingale bust that she's made, and it's been opened in Gun Hill Park in Aldershot. Aldershot seems to be getting all the sculptures at the moment. So at the rate she's producing, she's making me feel really bad, because it only goes to remind me that I need to get my finger out and start creating something new, because actually 2022 it's almost in sight. Today we're talking to Laury Dizengremel, and before telling you all about the fabulous things that she's done, I have to say that Laury was such a good sport, because the first time I recorded her, the entire production and backup recording failed. And so she's had to repeat this recording, which must be very tedious for her, but she did it with such good grace. And it only gave me more evidence, if I needed it, of what fantastic people sculptors are. Laury has done so many fascinating projects, there's far too many to list. But those you may have come across include a public sculpture of Capability Brown, Tony Byrne, the Olympic boxing medalist located in Drogheda, which is where I first discovered Laury, and Sir George Carteret in St Peter's, Jersey. She has a very pretty entry in the Emily Williamson campaign, and you can still vote for your favourite sculptors up until the 14th of November at emilywilliamsonstatue.com. I began our conversation today by asking how sculpture first came into her life.
You probably hear my American accent, and yet I'm the most American-sounding French person you'll ever meet. So when I was a baby, I was exported to the US from Paris, but then I was re-imported to France when I was 6. And from then on, of course, walking through Paris every day, going to school, growing up, age 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. I'm in Paris, and I'm seeing the most amazing sculptures everywhere. In the gardens of the Tuileries, in Trocadero, around Notre Dame, whether it's in architectural form, so caryatides and columns that support buildings or that adorn buildings, whether it's in reliefs that are on walls, whether it's in carvings that are inside buildings, or whether it's just in freestanding format, as in sculptures here and there. And of course, the huge amount of public art that there is, but also the huge amount of collection art there is in the museums and stuff. So I had parents who were incredibly inquisitive artistically, and they would drag me or take me. But, most kids, you have to drag them perhaps. A lot of kids, you might have to drag them. But with me, it was sort of definitely not a drag. I really, really loved going to museums. My mom was Dutch, so we would also go to Holland and visit museums there. And I was very fortunate in that I'm 67 now. So back in the day, I'm 14, going to places like Russia and visiting the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, and, just art, here and there and everywhere. So sculpture was always a part of it. And that was, seeing it was a very important thing. And then the other part of that was a book that I read, an amazing book by Pearl Buck, who was an American author. And she wrote a lot about Asia because her parents were missionaries in China. But one book she wrote, which actually was staged in the States, where a young woman discovers clay and becomes a sculptor. And the book is called A Proud Heart. And that book was just a total eye-opener for me. The way in which the relationship of this woman to clay and then to stone was just amazing. So that's your answer. That's how sculpture came into my life. The doing came a lot later. I actually thought I was going to be a dancer, a writer, a playwright, a poet. There were so many different art forms that pulled me. And I had no clue that I would turn my hand to sculpture. And then one day, quite late really, I was not quite pregnant with my first child. I'm sort of 24 maybe, living in LA at that point, having left France to come to the States to visit the States, and then having stayed a bit. And there I am. And suddenly my husband at the time said, "Hey, Laury, you've always talked about sculpture and how much you think it's, a wonderful art form. And we have a sculptor who's just hired a building that he had developed. There was an old firehouse in Venice, California. And this is before Venice became a hip place. It was when it was not a hip place. And that was it. I said, wow, that sounds interesting. A sculptor. Is she going to give classes? Yes, it's going to be a school. Cool. I went along. I put my hands on some clay, and it was as if I were coming home.
Gosh, isn't it strange that where, you see it often with children, though, when they pick up music and they just feel like they've come home, that familiarity with something that they couldn't, they haven't done before.
Yeah. I mean, Lucy, your life is also sculpture in a funny, you're a sculptor conservator, and you love all things sculpture, and I love all things sculpture, and it's my passion. I love all art forms. I find them all intriguing and interesting, but sculpture was where I found my happy place, and it literally was as if I had done it previously. I don't want to sound mystical or anything, but if one ever were to believe in past lives, then for sure it was as if I had done it before, that type of feeling. And I very rapidly acquired a certain amount of proficiency. I'm not saying that I became instantly brilliant at it or anything like that, but it was definitely something that didn't take me long to pick up. And also because I loved it so much, it was sort of like, it never is work. For example, I can't imagine myself ever retiring from being a sculptor. I will not retire. I will die being a sculptor. The only way that I would retire from being a sculptor would be if my hands got so messed up that I couldn't continue making it. Then of course that would be, limiting. But then I would probably start just writing poetry full time instead.
Well, it's quite hard on the body being especially large scale sculpture.
Oh yeah.
You have to, continuously maintain yourself, I find anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I've already had double carpal tunnel surgery on both hands. And, I have pain in my hands all the time. But I think that at the age of 67, having made sculpture since I was 24, that's a bit normal, really. Or I mean, I don't know if it's normal, but it's to be expected, shall we say.
And so was it the sculpture school that you stayed at and continued to train at, or did you go elsewhere?
Well, this was like a private small school, the Venice Sculpture Studio. And interestingly, the woman who ran that, Martine Vogel, she was half French and half American. And so we had a lot in common immediately in a funny sort of way. And even though I wasn't half American, I wasn't American at all, but because I had lived in America, there was an American sort of predisposition, so shall we say. But the thing is that Martine said to me that she had been trained by someone who had been trained by someone who had been trained by Rodin. Well, that's an amazing legacy, to think that I have been also trained by someone who has been trained by someone who's been trained by Rodin. And I know that when I was doing my first public commission for a town in France, and I was asked to make a portrait of Jean Jaurès, who was a French politician assassinated in 1914. So I'm taking photographs that I find in the National Library, and I'm taking all sorts of visual references as my guide to make the sculpture of this dead man. And basically, it's a journey of discovery, isn't it? When you're portraying someone, you're like, who is this person? Why do they deserve to be memorialized in sculpture format? And who is this? And how should I portray him differently to how he's been portrayed before, and so forth? Here I am making this sculpture of this famous politician, and at that point, all I've had is a few months of workshops back in California a few years before. I started then to be interested in acquiring more training. So I was very lucky to be allowed to attend a metal studio at the Beaux-Arts in Paris for a year, which wasn't really continuing on what I'd done before, because what I'd done before was mainly clay work. Although I had done a bit of foundry work also in order to cast some of my first pieces. I actually went and worked in a foundry for a very short period of time in LA. But so here I am in Paris at the Atelier de Métal of Monsieur Perrin, and I'm like learning to do welding and also exploring patinations on bronze, which I found fascinating and useful in later work. So that was a bit of formal training, but it wasn't really that formal because I was already, quote unquote, a mature student, and I was not a registered student to the Beaux-Arts. I was just a student of Monsieur Perrin's. So then it wasn't until I was much, much later, and I had done sculptures already all over the world as a guest of the United Nations, etc. And then I decided, I was often giving lectures in China, being invited to big symposia there. And people kept saying, so what's your training? Where were you trained, et cetera? And I'm like, I haven't got a degree. I haven't got a a fine art degree at all. And then I decided that I should go and remedy that, really. And I went and applied for a Master's of Fine Art International Practice degree at the University of Canterbury. Not the University of Canterbury, but in Canterbury at the college. What was it called? It was called the Creative College of something. Anyway, University of the Creative Arts in Canterbury. I applied for this MFA, 2-year MFA thing, and I find it interesting because the only people there who could really help me further with sculpture were the technicians. There was no sculpture teacher, no sculpture professor. The person who led the class was a printmaker. And the only other person that we had a little bit of interaction with was this one single theory lady professor who, of course, was trying to get everyone into a little postmodernist format where a sculpture isn't really the dumb thing, certainly not a figurative sculpture, and not the classical figurative sculpture. And I was encouraged to go anywhere but to figurative sculpture when I was doing that MFA. So I tried all sorts of other stuff. But of course, I came back to sculpture when it came to doing the final coursework and the final degree work, and made my Artists of the Silk Road, which were portraying the unknown artists who created all the amazing artwork on the Silk Road in China. So when you go to caves and see cave upon cave of full of Buddhas and bodhisattvas and other types of sculpture. And when you see, one huge fresco mural after another, you wonder who made those artworks, and you don't know. And my degree coursework ended up being focused on portraying imaginary artists.
The thing is that it's such a funny thing, isn't it? How you're already doing it. You were already being a professional sculptress by the sound of it. And yet, because of that lack of formal training, we kind of think, oh, no, I must need that. But it sounds like really you didn't. It sounds like it was a good opportunity to explore things, perhaps that you wouldn't have explored. But actually, there was no teacher that could teach you to be a professional because you were one.
Yeah, I was definitely professional. And I felt also that in the context of academia, I had to put food on the table my whole life. I've had to put food on the table from the time I was out of basic high school. I did my baccalaureate. And after that, I had to put food on the table for myself. And when I started to put food on the table solely with sculpture was in 2001, about that. And actually just 1999, 2000, 2001. And from then until now, that is how I have put food on the table. And I continue to have to put food on the table with it because, you have to live. And
life is expensive, let's face it.
Yeah, and what I found very interesting is that in the context of academia, fine art academia, it's a bit dirty to talk about being professional and making money. It's very interesting because it shouldn't be that way. I feel like it's really wrong to train people to be in the fine arts with a view to you must only research and you must only contextualize your practice and you must only think and mentally masturbate about your work and thinking about making a buck with it or a pound or a euro is wrong. And actually that is not so. It should not be so. Artists who end up never making a piece of art after they've left art school abound.
There's no other field in the world where that applies, and yet it does somehow in art and art-related fields.
It really does.
And you can tell that your success is because you have an entrepreneurial spirit. Something has burned inside you. Maybe it's the fact that you had practical things to do. You had to feed the family and you had to make ends meet. But that has opened doors for you and given you opportunities. And that's the thing I find utterly bizarre. How artists who haven't been taught to think like that don't realize that actually thinking like that is what can make you more successful.
There should be nothing wrong with you can be an artist and you can make money with it. And, there's no glory in being an artist behind closed doors where no one knows where to find you.
A little bit more about China, because this seems to feature heavily in your career and it's quite interesting. It's not just about the money. It's not just about it being cheap, I can tell.
Yeah, well, far from it. I mean, I actually used one of the top foundries in China. Ai Weiwei casts his work. His stuff that he did for the UN in New York and stuff like that, it was all cast at this foundry that I use. And I have a great relationship with the foundry manager. I mean, I actually stay with him and his wife. Their daughter calls me, Aunt Laury in Chinese. But, he was an interesting character because he had nothing to do with sculpture and foundries, was working at the American Embassy, I believe, for many years in Chengdu, and his father had a foundry, and his father died, and he was called upon to succeed him at the foundry. So came from being sort of an interpreter or whatever he was at the American Embassy to now being partner in a very large foundry, very successful foundry. I mean, they do gigantic pieces as well as very fine small pieces. They cast they cast my Lancelot Capability Brown, and they cast a few other pieces that I've done for various places. I will cast wherever I can. I've cast in Montana. I've cast in Dublin. I've cast in Paris. I've cast in Toulouse recently because of the pandemic, I was stuck in France for part of the time, which was not a bad thing. But I'm just saying I had to then adapt, and I've adapted to whatever foundry I have to. But when I first was invited to China to a sculpture symposium in 2001, I met an amazing young woman who quite a bit younger than I. There were 5 women sculptors and 45, male sculptors, not an unusual ratio at a sculpture symposium. And she and I became friends. And that friendship then led me to, that foundry, et cetera, et cetera. And, I have spent over 3 years in China, if you put the time together, here a month, there 2 months, etc. Since 2001, I've spent over 3 years in China.
The projects that you make happen, because I know you're quite an unusual sculptress in the sense that you don't always just do commissions that are put out there. You make commissions happen by saying we need a sculpture for this. Do you choose to do it in China?
Sometimes I choose to do it in China. Sometimes I'm told, there was a committee in Wales a few years ago who said, well, we need you to make it in Great Britain. We don't want it to be made in China. And also, frankly, their timeline was so quick. Like, it was one of those situations where they called me in January and said, we have to have the money spent by March. I'm not quite sure how that works, but you know how there's financial years and all this other stuff. And if you have, I suppose if you have raised the funds for a public artwork, and it somehow needs to come out of the public purse by, before the financial year is over or something like that. I'm not quite sure how that all works, but that's how that's kind of how they explained it to me. And the sculptor that they had planned on using had fallen through. I was actually their second choice, and had been informed a few months before. It was one of those competition things for, and we'd been 3 shortlisted sculptors, and I had been informed that I hadn't made it. This other guy had made it, but then this other guy raised his price at the last minute so terrifically that they were like, oops, we can't do that anymore because that's not how much we've got. So they then remembered that they had liked me as well, as much, and also that I had said that I could do it more cheaply, regardless of where I made it, whether I made it in England, which that one I ended up casting in the Midlands. It's not just in China that I cast. I cast wherever it is right for me to cast.
Tell us a little bit, Laury, about how you make these projects happen, because I think that's a really interesting business model.
I'll give you an example. A few years ago, about 11 years ago, I decided that I wanted to possibly do a PhD that would be focused on artist-led initiatives. So me as a sculptor going and, drumming up work, basically, getting work to happen. And interestingly enough, I was about to start doing that PhD. I was going to do start with an MRes leading to a PhD at the University of Lincoln in the Midlands. And then I was like, this is silly. I don't need to be doing another degree. I just need to be doing this. And I literally called 5 stately homes in the Midlands and offered myself to each one of them as somebody who could give them free advice to create a sculpture trail on their grounds. And the sculpture trail wasn't going to consist of just my sculptures. It was going to consist of sculptures by a whole bunch of sculptors from around the world, or from around the UK if that's how they preferred to play it. So I made those calls and I left messages on some occasions because it was just there'd be a voicemail thing. And interestingly, out of the 5 stately homes that I called, I got 5 calls back within 24 hours, So that was an example of me initiating something. Now, out of those 5, the first one that I went to see was the Duchess of Rutland at Belvoir Castle. And she likes to tell her story that I came knocking at the back door. I didn't come knocking at the back door. I called, left a message. And one of her PAs picked up the message, went and told Emma, the Duchess, Your Grace, the sculptor has called and is offering to meet you and give you some free consultancy, perhaps about a sculpture trail. And Emma said, make an appointment for her. So I had an appointment, 48 hours after that first phone call, I was on my way to meet the Duchess of Rutland. And I arrived there, and she wasn't interested in the sculpture trail, not really. What she was interested in is me creating the busts of her 5 children, and then later possibly a bust of herself and of the Duke. I ended up doing the 5 children. I ended up doing the Duchess. I didn't end up doing the Duke's portrait, but they all are another layer of art in that amazing venue, which is laden with history and has portraits by Joshua Reynolds and George Stubbs on the walls. So, I've added another layer of history to that castle, and of art to that castle, which is really cool.
And all by being brave, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I decided years ago that I had to be that kind of brave in order to survive, if I wanted to survive as an artist, and that it was okay to do it, that it wasn't dirty, quote unquote dirty, to promote and to seek work. And through that residency, because I've been artist in residence now, I thought it was going to last a year, that artist, the artist residence at Belvoir Castle. And I'm still at it. I give her Grace 5% of my time a year, not more. I do lots of other work, but I continue to do sculptures for her, for the estate. And, I made a pair of gigantic steel horses. I've done life-size stag and life-size horses, several horses. And I've enjoyed it tremendously, and it's been fun. And I've also had occasion to meet a lot of her guests. She has guests who are from all walks of life, who come to visit the castle or shoot on the estate or whatever they do for various reasons. And people commission me to do their wife's portrait, or to do their, girlfriend's dog portrait, or whatever. And I'm grateful for the work.
So the Emily Williamson competition, tell us a little bit about your entry for it.
Yeah, I was approached by the guy who spearheads the project, Andrew Simcock. He's a councillor for Didsbury in Manchester. And he read an article in a national newspaper at the time when there was the furore last year regarding the Mary Wollstonecraft statue, the Maggie Hamlin. And there was an article in which it was discussed how whether it was questionably in good taste or the right thing to do to portray a woman of achievement such as Mary Wollstonecraft as a nude. And one of the projects being made at the time was my sculpture of Virginia Woolf seated on a bench, and she's got clothes on. She's got clothes on.
Excellent.
Which is very seemly, actually, and quite right. You don't portray a feminist icon with no clothes, I think. That was, in my opinion, Maggie made a choice, and it wasn't, in my opinion, the right choice, but that's fine. I mean, I'm not dissing her work as a fellow sculptor generally, but that was, in my opinion, just not the right call for to portray a feminist icon. At any rate, with Emily Williamson, it was a very interesting request from Andrew, because he asked me, would I take part in the competition? And I was like, oh, gosh, really? I hate competitions. I think competitions are great when it comes to sports and things like that. When it comes to art, yeah, I'm not feeling it generally. I don't like it, because you look at the 4 entries for the Emily Williamson that have been made by myself and the other 3 sculptors, Claire Abbott and Billy Bond and Eve Shepherd. And every one of them has merit. And, my money's on Eve, but that's just because I think that she really was so clever with her concept of the skirt, dissolving into cliff faces and in the folds of it, all these birds that are either endangered or not endangered, but either way, like birds. It was so clever. Every one of us portrayed Emily with a bird in some way, a bird in hand or a bird close to, but putting that many of them in her composition was absolutely brilliant. So Of course, I still nurture some hope that it could be that I might get picked, but because, again, I got to put food on the table. But I think Eve is remarkable. But I also think that every one of us put a lot of thought and research and all that stuff into it. They all portray Emily Williamson. And she, this is another opportunity to redress the imbalance of female and male statuary.
Was there a particular aspect to the story that inspired your entry?
I think that for me, I just wanted the simplicity of the brief was it had to look like her, and there's only one picture. Now, having only one picture isn't the end of the world because, with Capability Brown, there were 2 paintings, and I had to choose one. There was one in the National Portrait Gallery and one in a private collection. With Emily Williamson, there's this one photograph. So it's got to look like her. That's a given. And then, her the main reason why she is being celebrated here is for her work to found, to enact the Plumage Act, which had to do with, getting rid of the despicable trade of having to kill tons and tons and tons of birds solely for their feathers. We're not talking about birds that you have lunch on afterwards and, the feathers are occasionally used on a hat. We're talking about birds of all types, exotic birds that you would never dream of eating, tiny ones, etc. So it was what she did was a remarkable thing, and she deserves to be portrayed. And what I felt was I just wanted to show her as I saw her from that one photograph, showing a relationship. The communication is quite simple. The communication is between her and that bird, and hopefully then the viewer is intrigued and goes, "Ooh, what's this about then? Who's this and why is it here?" And then they learn more about the history and so forth.
Oh, Laury, you've been really, really fantastic to talk to today. I appreciate it so much. We wish you all the best with the campaign. Who knows who's going to get it? It's going to be really interesting to find out. I loved Laury's description of her first meeting with clay, of coming home. It's just such a strange idea that things that we've never come across in our lives could be familiar. And not that we're necessarily outstanding at them the very moment that we start them. That's definitely not the case. But that sense that we want to keep returning to them, reminds me of that lovely scene by Kenneth Grahame in The Wind of the Willows when Mole sniffs home, and despite his very exciting, much more exciting life with Ratty than he had, he just can't tear himself away from it. Now, Laury has lived quite the international life. Casting and working anywhere in the world doesn't seem to faze her at all. Possibly that's an element of her upbringing, but the whole world is her playground. And though it actually sounds quite James Bond when I put it like that, it's actually quite a brilliant business strategy to think so epically big. She didn't mention in her chat today, but if you look on her website, she has taken the time to forge relationships and make agents all over the world. She's marketed herself globally, and I'm sure that projects trickle in from all sorts of directions because of that time she took to do that. And I really love this idea of casting your net so wide as a creative in any industry. You can sometimes feel daunted at the idea of just getting established. But when you think of how many people there are in the world, the maths plays more in your favour. For me, I like to think of how many English speakers there are in the world. So I may not be selling in the UK like Dan Brown, but there are places all over the world that speak English and people who are buying my books all over the world. And there'll be people looking for your exact kind of sculpture, maybe not necessarily in the village next door to where you live, but certainly when you look as wide as the whole world. She's a very practical soul, Laury. Her art is important to her, absolutely no doubt, but she has had to put food on the table, and so she's had to make it pay. Now, this is a lovely conundrum. Has she done as well as she has because her art speaks to people? Or has she done so well because she's made people listen? I think there's no doubt that her need to be entrepreneurial has meant that she has driven opportunities towards her, and this has established her, enabled her to pay her bills, but also to grow as a sculptor. You can't help but grow when you have so many different variety of projects from different cultures all being offered to you. She's reminded me how important it is to create and market, much as many of us prefer to do one a lot more than the other. They are the yin and yang of success, and it's clear to see that Laury is blazing that trail. Please support the podcast in one of 3 different ways. You can pick up one of my novels about the dark side of the art world, or if you prefer a dash of murder in your fiction, there's this year's novel, Restoration Murder, which is out now. Or finally, you can tell someone about an episode that you've enjoyed and got value from, which will bring more people into our tribe of sculpture vultures. Next week, I'll be interviewing Peter Newman on the podcast. Peter has exhibited in Trafalgar Square, the Royal Festival Hall and the Hayward Gallery in London, the Turner Contemporary in Margate and the Guggenheim Museum in Venice, one of my favourite places. His work can be found all over the world in public and private collections. Be inspired by sculpture with Peter Newman. If you're looking for a new book, please consider one of my novels about the dark side of the art world, where sculpture is always at the heart of the story. You can get them on the show website, on the usual online retailers, or even better, keep your local library alive, ask for them in there. Thank you for joining me today. Sculpture Vulture has been brought to you by Antique Bronze.